Afternoon. We'll go ahead and get started. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for attending our webinar, which is part of a series of webinars on the science of reading. I am Dr. Margaret Opatz. I'm a reading research scientist here at CAPTI. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Ryan Hershey, who brings decades of educational experience to his role as a literacy specialist here at CAPTI. We hope that today's webinar will help to expand your understanding of really supporting students with their sentence processing skills. So without further ado, we'll get started with our webinar, which is called Using the Science of Reading to Develop Sentence Processing Skills. So I am happy to have you here today. As Ryan and I were preparing this, we were having just a lot of fun with the preparations because I think sentence processing is one of the fun things that we can teach in order to really support readers in becoming more skilled. So as far as our agenda goes for today, we will start off with a discussion surrounding the science of reading and kind of pinpointing where sentence processing skills kind of fit within that framework. And then we'll talk a little bit more in depth about the language structure strands that we're pulling that from Scarborough's reading rope, which is based in the science of reading and is something that you've probably seen if you've done any type of reading or attended other webinars based on the science of reading. And then we're going to take you through some activities about how we can really address sentence processing skills in the classroom. I'll show you some examples, and then we'll definitely have some resources for you. We'll do a short kind of conversation about why we want to promote syntax and semantic development specifically. And then Ryan will take us through how we can measure silent reading fluency, which that should actually say sentence processing. I'm just noticing that now. So he'll take us through measuring sentence processing skills. And then we'll leave some time at the end for any questions and answers. So before we get into kind of the research behind all of this, we thought it might be kind of interesting to kind of explore the sentence level skills that we frequently use in conversation so that we can differentiate that once we get into the more text-based conversation. So Ryan's going to start us off and take us through a little bit of kind of this introductory activity to kind of frame our webinar.
Yeah, so we'll start with just a simple sentence. Just thought it would be fun to come up with some conversational examples. We'll start with this simple sentence. What are we doing here? And I'm just going to add an example of a discourse marker at the beginning. And then Margaret's going to tell me how she comprehends that sentence based on the marker, that word or phrase I put at the beginning. Sound good, Margaret?
Sounds good.
Okay, first one I'll use is, what are we doing here?
You sound either bored or confused.
Both of those are correct. I am currently bored and confused. All right, here's another one. Well, what are we doing here?
That one I would say you're kind of annoyed.
Usually, yeah. And then the last one, my favorite. I mean, what are we doing here?
That one you definitely sound like middle school students that I've worked with.
That makes sense because I taught middle school for many years. So
yeah, maybe a little bit despondent. So we've gone through just this like short kind of conversational example just to really pinpoint the sentence processing skills of that of the discourse markers. So when we think about a discourse marker, like Ryan used, well, I mean, and those are really frequently used in conversational language. We also have the value or like that added value of being able to see the way that people are gesturing or the way that they look. We also have that intonation. But when we get into the text, we are entering into a world where we don't have that same support of gestures. We can't see how the author's presenting it by using their hands or like getting excited to present the information. It's all decontextualized. So that makes sentence processing a little bit more difficult when we get into simply text-based comprehension and sentence processing skills. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and this next slide isn't specifically focused on discourse markers, but what I want you to do is just take a minute and actually you won't need a minute. Just take a few seconds and read the next slide and read the sentence that's on the slide. I hope that you had enough time to read that. So this sentence came from, I cannot recall if it was a fifth or a sixth grade science textbook. So when we're thinking about this sentence, this is going to be very challenging for students to comprehend. And this is just one sentence. So when we're thinking about sentence processing skills, this is one sentence that students really have to unpack all of the meaning that is just packed so tightly into this sentence to really be able to make meaning from it. So when we think about what students have to do with this type of sentence, it's actually quite a feat that we can even like help students make sense of this. But there's a few things that we can do to really support students. So I hope that everyone agrees that this is a challenging sentence. I will admit the first time that I read it, I thought I would never use the word rupture to describe the opening of a volcano. Like that is definitely like something that I think is a higher level type of word to mean opening. And then also to describe a volcano as being like in the crust of a planetary mass object. That also seems like a very difficult way to present that information. I understand why it's presented that way when we think about science. Scientists are definitely going to present it in the most informative way or factual way that they can, but that does present a lot of challenges for students. So when we look at the sentence, we actually know that processing language will occur at various levels. So first, students have to be able to process at the word level. So that means that they have to be able to understand what each of these words really means, and then they can put them together to contextualize. So at the word level, students would have to understand like the word volcano. I picked volcano because I think most people know what a volcano is, and that really is like the thing that we're talking about here. And then also within the sentence, students will have to be able to comprehend or like process the language at the phrasal level. So this is where we're putting these meaningful units of information together. And as we know too, like the phrasal level is so important because that's actually where Tim Brzezinski and other researchers have found that we are doing the comprehension at that phrasal level. So can we put words together into these meaningful phrase units to be able to comprehend? So those are the first two ways that we really do process language. And then we can expand it to more of the sentence level. So taking in this entire sentence to be able to really understand that within this sentence, a volcano has this opening and then it's going to release volcanic matter. So that could be like lava, ash, and gas. So we're going to be able to do that processing at these various levels, and that's how our brain works. We process first at that word level, then we're going to move to that phrase level, sentence level, and then if I were to share a complete text with you, then that would be the text level. That next piece is constructing that mental model that occurs through integrating all of this information across the entire text. So I didn't share an entire text with you today because we are really focused on sentence processing throughout this webinar. But before I get like too deep into sentence processing, I just kind of want to contextualize where this really comes from and like why it is so important by basing the conversation as we move forward in the science of reading. So I mentioned that like you're probably familiar with the phrase the science of reading. And what this really is like we have decades of research that really comes from this interdisciplinary body of research. So it's coming from not just education, but also like linguistics and cognitive sciences. And the research is really vast. It's been conducted across the world and in multiple languages. And really, the outcome is that we are using the evidence from all of the research that has occurred in the past to really inform our understanding of how proficient reading and writing develop. We know that there is kind of this trajectory that students follow to be able to become skilled readers. The research has also helped us inform why some students just have difficulty. And that's one of the things that we'll definitely address today is that if students are having difficulty comprehending at that sentence level, there's a reason for it. And there's things that we can do to really support students in making sense of sentences that are really difficult to comprehend. And then the final thing that the science of reading helps us with is really informing what are best practices for teaching reading and writing, but also for assessing it. And I think that assessment piece is a really important part of it. We know that there's better ways to assess than others. So Ryan will take us through a little bit of that at the end. So this is Scarborough's reading rope. And when we look at Scarborough's reading rope, we can see that there's these two broad categories of language comprehension and word recognition. These two larger strands really do work together as they help to really inform the other. So we know that if you can recognize the word on the page, then you're going to be able to comprehend the language that's used on the page as well. And then as the threads start to develop, students start to weave them together and increase their automaticity and become more strategic. And this will lead to skilled reading, and that's the ultimate goal. So as far as today's webinar goes, we're really going to focus on these language structures. And within language structures, there's two that are really highlighted here. So we have syntax and semantics. I want to start off with syntax just to kind of lay a foundation of like, what do we mean when we say syntax? I know for some people, they may have done some like diagramming of sentences when they were kids. I definitely did not get that in school. So I just want to like base the conversation in what is syntax. So when we talk about syntax, we're talking about the word order rules. So it's really referring to that formation of sentences and what are the rules that really govern how we're putting those the words within the sentence together. And then this is really important because when we look at syntax, syntactic skills are actually correlated with reading comprehension and language comprehension. So it's really important for students to be able to understand why does the adjective come before the noun? So that they can really be able to comprehend the way that text is constructed. And then we also know that syntax and grammar knowledge are predictors for later reading comprehension ability. So if students are really struggling at this sentence level, they do need support in order to be able to comprehend and be successful long term. So then as far as semantics goes, this is really the study of meaning. So we're like thinking about what do words mean and what do sentences mean? I think this is a really important point to make that within a sentence, the words matter. So if I say the triangle is in the circle, that's going to look very different from the circle is in the triangle. So we have to be able to really teach students how to construct that meaning of the words within the sentence and then how they work together. So that's what we're really talking about when we talk about sentence processing. We're talking about word order, why we construct sentences the way we do. And then we're also talking about how do we build meaning from those words that are in the sentence to be able to like create this like cohesive mental model of what we've just read. So we're going to move into how can we really address sentence processing in the classroom. Before we get into specific examples, I just want to point out that it's really important for us to promote these language structures in the classroom because there's this phrase that DeJong and Harper termed language transparency. And basically, what they said is that um, as teachers, we often don't get a lot of training in like the linguistic aspects of language. So we don't often get a lot of training in like the grammatical side or the syntax, like why words work in the way that they do. So as teachers, we tend to look at a text and highlight the content within it to say if it's a science text, it's really going to be the content knowledge that's important for students to be able to understand this text. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't actually show us um, what what causes the text to be so difficult. Why is the construction of the text likely to cause issues for students? So as far as DeJong and Harper go, they say like we look through the text to the content, and then Lucas and colleagues came and said that the focus truly tends to be on the content with no acknowledgement of the language used to construct disciplinary meaning. So for students, they have to be able to understand the construction of those grammatical elements within the sentence and ultimately the text. To be able to construct meaning from it. I'll share a couple of examples, but today, like the key takeaway here is that we do have to make language opaque. We have to be able to look at the language used within a sentence and say, oh, here are the word order rules or the syntax rules, and here's why a scientist writes that way, or here's why a historian writes that way. And then Orzulak really says that, like, in order for us to promote these language structures in the classroom, we really need to move beyond, does that sound right? Because if we're asking students, does it sound right? Or if you're reading it and you're like, yep, that sounds right, we need to move beyond that to actually rely on the rules that govern language in order to empower students to be able to do that same thing. So as native English speakers, as most teachers are in the US, we, and I'm also a native speaker, so I'm saying we here, but native English speakers tend to just be able to rely on if it sounds right or not, because we've just implicitly learned all of the rules, but we do have to make those explicit for students. So that's one of the things that we'll look at during today. So when we really do promote language structures in the classroom, our ultimate goal is to gain meaning from the text. So I like this idea that Green suggests is that we should encourage all of our students to become language detectives. So this would encourage them to explore and question the meaning of text. And then in order to do this, they can really investigate the relationship between words, phrases, and clauses. And then they can also look at sentences, paragraphs, and the text. Okay, so we'll get into kind of how to do this now. Sorry, I just got distracted by a question here. Yeah, let's come back to this question, Amy. We'll come back to it at the end. So, as far as promoting language structures, the one thing that we can do is foster interest in language through play. So I think that kind of sounds like a little bit silly maybe, but we can really play with language and encourage students to play with language because the more that they play with it, the more comfortable they will be to try out different structures and to take risks within language. I think for a long time, there's kind of like this model of instruction where you would turn in a paper and get all the red ink that the teacher wanted to put on it back, and it didn't necessarily help us in developing our reading and writing skills. So we definitely want to like lower the effective filter and really encourage play so that students can really test out, can I try this? Like, here's a published author, here's somebody that I really like their writing. Can I test out the type of sentence that they used in my own writing? So I have an example here on the right from Maya Angelou. So you could actually imitate sentences from some of the text that you're reading, and get students to test it out. Can they use that same type of sentence structure to write their own sentence? And what made it sound like? Could they make it better? Could they change it to, um, like differentiate the message? So that's one way. So that's fostering interest in language through play. And then the next one is teaching word order rules. So going back to syntax, I have a learning activity that I used a lot when I was teaching elementary and middle school. So I'll share that with you as well. And then we can investigate how sentences are built and then imitate them, which is similar to that first one of play. And then we can also show students how to expand sentences. So because we're talking about sentence processing, some of the best ways to really support reading is actually teaching students how to write better. So we can actually use that reciprocal skill of reading and writing in order to improve the other skill. We can also do some sentence combining where we're going to take these short sentences and then make them into more complex sentences. And in order to really do that, students really have to know the various features of phrases, clauses, and sentences. So I have some resources for that as well later on. So I do think it's important just to note that there actually has been positive effects of sentence combining on reading comprehension. So really teaching students how to write better will actually support their reading development if it's done explicitly. So that's really the key here, is that it needs to be that explicit connection. Like, we were just doing it in writing. Now let's look at this. Like, this is like a very similar sentence in a text, and students will be able to, or should be able to, comprehend that more difficult text. Okay, so I'm going to jump into our first part of really what we should do to support students in developing the language structure. So the first thing we can do is really teach word order rules. So when we think about this, there are some basic syntax rules that we can really use to support elementary all the way up through high school readers. So we can teach these rules, and then we can support students in developing their writing and their reading ability by teaching these rules. So for instance, if you taught that students that the subject comes before the verb, and you can teach them nouns and pronouns, they can write an example. So all of my examples today will be of volcanoes. A couple years ago, I really got into volcanoes when I was doing a study with a fifth grade classroom. So I've kind of continued that theme throughout here. But you can really then differentiate, if you're teaching word order rules, to the content area that you're focused on. So if we're talking about teaching in a fifth grade classroom and your content is volcanoes for that unit, you can really focus on that to be able to support students in learning not just the word order rules, but also some content as well. So, okay, so I said you could teach that subject plus verb. That is one way that word order rules work within a sentence. And then we can also teach them the adjective comes before the noun, or we could teach them there's a noun plus a linking verb plus an adjective, and then give them these examples. So the reason that we would do this is to really help students build their metacognition of, it's actually meta-linguistic awareness of language. So one of the best ways that I found to really do this and support students was to use the strategy called syntax surgery. I'm sure you could call it a number of different things, but when my seventh graders heard that they were doing surgery, they thought that was really fun. So I went with it. So here's the way that syntax surgery works. What you can do is you'll first of all find a complex sentence that you want students to really focus on. And then what students will do is they will arrange the words and record the sentence. And then you ask students, well, what are the syntax rules that are represented in the sentence? And this is, of course, after you've taught the rules. So then they would identify the various rules and then keep rearranging the words and record those sentences until they can no longer create any other sentences. So here's one. I pulled this from that first sentence that I shared earlier. I did pare it down a little bit just so I could fit all of the words on the screen. But here's what we could do. We can give students the words that they're out of order, and then they're going to um, arrange the words and then record the sentence. So within that Google Drive that Brian shared, I have a recording page. It's nothing special, but it's something that I just found to be helpful as I work with, as I continue to work with pre-service teachers and also teachers within schools. So here's one sentence that they could write. You could say, an eruption allows matter to escape Earth's crust. Now, this I mentioned came from that longer sentence at the beginning. If a student came up with this this sentence that really kind of like gets to the heart of that sentence, I would be really happy with this because it would tell me that they were able to kind of like look past all of those phrases that were kind of like additional information within that sentence to really get to the heart of what the sentence was trying to say. So that would be the first step. They arrange the words and then record the sentence. And then students are asked to identify those syntax rules that are represented within that sentence. So to do this, they do need to have some basic syntax rules. You'll see this comes from Innovative Grammar. I should say the rules come from Innovative Grammar, just like the structure that they put it together in. But these are really just basic syntax rules that if students have an understanding of these rules, it's really beneficial to be able to support their reading and writing development. So once students do have an understanding of what these syntax rules look like, then you can say, okay, let's identify what are the syntax rules represented in this sentence. So a couple that they might find is we have an eruption. So that actually matches an adjective comes before the noun. So they could put that there and then say that here's where they found it. They could also say verb comes before the noun, which is down here, number 9. And this is a transitive verb. So allows matter. So allows has to be connected to matter. So it's a transitive verb. It connects to that. So those are 2 of the syntax rules that are represented within this sentence. And you could definitely ask students if there were any others. But that's one way to do syntax surgery. So then step 3 would be to have them keep rearranging the word cards until they can't come up with any more sentences. Or, if time allows you to only do a few, to just do a few. But really, this is just about playing with the words within this sentence to be able to make meaning of the sentence and also connect it back to the syntax rules. Like, why do they work the way why do the words work the way that they do? I should also mention, this is actually a really important concept too, in terms of when students are rearranging the words, you could actually focus on like the word eruption. You could focus on the morphemes within that word as well to say like there's T-I-O-N, or it's really I-O-N at the end to change that verb of that eruption changed from the verb erupt to eruption, which is like that whole process. So scientists use a lot of nominalizing of verbs so that they can package all of that process into just one neat little word. But that does a lot to really help students like to be able to unpack the meaning within the sentence. Yvonne, is this work done prior to the reading in the text? I would say you could do it either way. One thing that can be helpful is you could use it as a preview of reading as you're kind of like getting into the text, or you could say, we're going to go back to the text. That's a great question. But yes, I think you could do it either way, especially if you notice that students really struggled with that one specific sentence. Um, you could really focus on saying, we're going to go back to this really difficult sentence that took us like a really like long time to kind of figure out what are they trying to say here. And that could be something that um, could help students as well. All right, so once students kind of like know that word order, uh, have a grasp of word order rules and that those do exist, we can also teach students basic phrases. So students should know that there are that phrases exist. We want to encourage them to read at that phrasal level. Um, you'll notice that as students are building their fluency, you'll definitely be able to notice that there's a difference between when they're reading word by word as when they're reading phrase by phrase. Their fluency is definitely increasing. And then we can almost hear them comprehend. So we should teach students these basic phrases that like there's something called a noun phrase. And that's when we have the noun of the villager, and then we're adding adjectives before it to really describe like what type of villager we're talking about. We should also teach them that there's a phrase that includes adjectives. So we have the and worried. That's another phrase. So it's that adjective level phrase. And then we should also teach them about verb phrases. So um, we can really show them like here's was, and we're going to connect all of the information that's coming right behind it to that verb, and that is a phrase. So we can teach them the requirements of the phrase. Like here it says a verb phrase, we must have a verb, and then it may contain all of these other parts of language, but we can really teach them how to find that within a sentence. I will say when you're doing this, it's important to control the sentences that you're providing to students to ensure that students can really gain the meaning that you want them to um, from the actual sentence. And I say that just because you can see here that I have a noun, adjective, verb, and prepositional phrase all within the same sentence. So that's very intentional. And then that brings us to prepositional. Students should also know that there are prepositional phrases, and then you can teach them the function of it. What is it doing? And here it's really telling us where this person's at. Okay, so I encourage you to think about doing it from the level that I've taken it from. So we did word order rules first, then we've expanded it to these basic phrases. And I say basic phrases, I think these work really from elementary to high school, doing phrases like this. I've even done it within teacher preparation. And these basic phrases, and I'll get to clauses and sentence types next, but those can really take us a long ways just in building enough content knowledge to be able to work more meaningfully with language. So once students have that understanding of, of phrases, we can move to the clausal level. So we can teach them these basic clauses. So we can look at an independent clause, and we can teach them that this does stand alone as a complete thought. And something that's nice is if you've already taught those word order rules, those basic syntax rules, you can actually ask students like, is there a subject in this clause, and is there a verb? And students should be able to say, oh yeah, the volcano is the subject and erupts is the verb. And that's exactly what we want to be able to do. We want to build their metalinguistic awareness so that they can talk about language in a way that empowers them. And then, okay, so then next we would teach them dependent clauses, and we would tell them that this one cannot stand alone. It has to have an independent clause that comes with it. And then something that I think is really powerful in terms of teaching writing specifically is that we can teach them how to use those subordinating conjunctions to really connect these two ideas together. So we could teach them to use when at the beginning of a sentence, and we can say when the volcano erupts. And we can be careful to really show them that this does not stand alone. we can say, well, what happens, right? Like when the volcano erupts, well, then what? Um, they should be thinking like that too, and this will really help them build again their meta-linguistic awareness. Um, so then we can also teach them restrictive relative and non-restrictive relative clauses. And these can be really helpful in terms of helping them really be able to expand their understanding of how to write within the content areas. So we can teach them how to add this additional information without having that same kind of like choppy sentence structure where they're writing pretty like simple sentences. They can start to expand their understanding of how to write by adding in more details. So for this one, we could teach them again the purpose or the requirements of it. So we're going to define the meaning of the noun or phrase or noun phrase. So the volcano that started erupting yesterday, when we have this underlined restrictive relative clause, that's really adding information. We're specifying what volcano are we talking about. And this would be a way to like help them also differ in their language construction. So instead of just like maybe it was Kilauea erupting, instead of saying Kilauea, Kilauea all the time, they can get more creative in how they're constructing sentences to offer that variation for their reader. But then we can also take it back to the text that you're reading and actually improve reading comprehension by being able to say, what is this clause referring back to? Like, what is it adding to? So it really does help when they're building their knowledge base. We can also teach non-restrictive relative clauses. So something here, if we have the name of the volcanologist after this, that is definitely information that like we don't necessarily need. It's additional. Maybe it's nice to know her name if it came up again. But here we would be able to teach them like when we're offsetting using those commas, that is a reflection of it being a non-restrictive relative clause where it's just adding this information, but it's not imperative for us to understand the text. Okay, so then, so now we've gone from that word level, phrase level, clause level to really that sentence level. And I like to go that way because you're really building up over time. I think when we start at like that sentence level, it can be somewhat tricky to identify all of these pieces all at once. So I like this idea of really building over time. So as far as teaching sentences go, we can teach simple, compound, complex, and then compound complex sentences and really build off of that. So again, I would want to be very controlled with how you're presenting this information to students so that you can show them how you can build across like how do we make a simple sentence into a compound sentence or into a complex sentence and really show them how we can like build to construct these different sentence types. Um, so those are some ideas in terms of like how we can really build that knowledge across each of those components of language. But there's also, this comes from Spivey, and I searched the internet for Spivey writing instruction and I couldn't find anything anymore. So I'm not sure exactly what happened to Spivey, but I loved this idea when I first started teaching, and it's something that I continue to use. Even with pre-service teachers, I'll use this type of instruction because I think it's really helpful in terms of being able to expand sentences in writing, but then also to be able to look at sentences that students are reading to be able to identify these various characteristics. So when we expand sentences, we can ask students to really think about who, what, where, when, and why. And to do this, I thought about this, like I have this picture here of these volcanologists are near a volcano. So I can come up with who, and when you're first doing this, it's really helpful to have people in the image. So I did find a picture of volcanologists, and then what are they doing? And so here I put in hiked. So we want the verb there. So we have who, what, and then where, and they're near the volcano, and then who, what, where, when, and I'm using that the the word during the initial stages of the eruption. So then we say why. Why are they there? So Yvonne, thanks for sharing. Christina Smenkins, that's great. Thanks for sharing that resource. Everyone can see that in the chat. So as far as this goes, like it's really helpful to be able to help students really explain in detail the who, what, where, when, why. And then what we can do is really think about how do we transfer this writing skill into reading? So I mentioned that when you're first doing this, it's helpful to have people involved, or like maybe it's like an animal or something. Because when we're saying who, within this context, they're going to have to say that the who is the volcano. And that can be somewhat abstract for students when you're first really getting into looking at being able to transfer that type of writing activity into reading and being able to analyze words at that level of the who, what, where, when, why. But then I just took a look at this and I was able to really think about this, that we could say, who is the volcano? Like that's really the important piece of information here that we're discussing. And then I have what, and these are openings or vents. And then I noticed that like there's like this clause that we're also kind of like putting these groups of information together. So we have another kind of who, and then it's doing what, and it's erupting. So we can go through and kind of label language within that same way to really, I heard somebody one time call it text cavate, where you're like digging out the meaning of the text by being able to rely on those who, what, where, when, why type questions. Okay, I've kind of thrown a lot of details at you, but I want to get into some more of like that sentence level processing and some of those skills that we talked about at the very beginning, where Ryan was giving us some of those discourse markers. So one of the things that we know about constructing meaning across text is that there are specific words that we use that really help to develop the way that we reason across a text. These differ markedly from conversational language. We don't write in a text, but we say it all the time. So we're still using these logical connectors or these logical connections to really be able to create the connections across the text. And these can be explicitly marked. But what we notice is when you get to like middle and high school, we actually can't rely on the explicit markers anymore. They actually just like kind of like disappear and become implicit. So in elementary school, you'll likely see the word because, but then when we get into middle and high school, they become implicit, and students really have to be able to understand that language construction to be able to understand that both of these are signaling, both of the examples here are signaling that causality, but one has this explicit marker that kind of like, like jumps out and says like, hey, make sure you recognize this. And then the other one, you have to read sort of between the lines to be able to understand what's being said. And in order to really do that well, it would really benefit students to be able to understand that language construction. I just had another example there. Okay, so another thing that happens within constructing meaning across the text is we use these chains of reference by using specific reference that are pronouns and synonyms. And these are something that Kylene Beers and Robert Prost have this in their nonfiction book that they published in 2016 that I like their examples in that book as well. Chandra, thanks for sharing out that book about the writing revolution. I think that's a great resource as well. But as far as the reference go, is we often use these reference of like a pronoun. So we say the banker in the start of the sentence, and then the next sentence we say he. We do that so that our sentences aren't like feeling mechanical. We have that variation to make it more interesting for the reader, but this also causes problems for students. And we get into more of the problems when we're using demonstrative pronouns like this to package all of the information in the previous sentence. So words like this or these can become really challenging for students if they don't understand the connection between what this is packaging from that previous sentence. And then the final one is synonyms. We use synonyms a lot again for that variation. We don't want our readers to get bored of us saying the printing press, the printing press, but that can cause issues for comprehension as we're reading across this sentence and then connecting to the next sentence. We have to be able to recognize that we're referring back to the printing press. So what's really important to do here is connect the pronoun or the synonym back to what it's referring to. As I did mention, like this and these or those are much more challenging and will take time for students to be able to kind of summarize what is it that they're referring to, that the author is referring to. And then just to kind of like wrap up all that we've gone through, I do think that it's really important to focus on that gradual release of responsibility when you're teaching language structures. Specifically, when we think about like syntax surgery, I would do that whole group multiple times, make it kind of fun, like, oh, what else do you see? What other syntax rules are you noticing? And really helping them to be able to first see me do it, and then we'll do it multiple times, and then they can try doing it. I think it's important for us to know too that we want students to play around with language. We want them to imitate patterns, but we're not necessarily looking for perfection. That will come with more and more practice. They'll get more and more skilled with it. But that's really important to just note that we're really looking for that gradual release of responsibility as students feel more empowered and confident to identify those various language features. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the time over to Ryan, who's going to talk a little bit about how we can actually measure sentence processing skills.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. So as she emphasized, and you can go to the next screen. The sentence processing skill is heavily associated with the language comprehension strands, specifically language structures. So I'm going to show you what a sentence processing assessment looks like, and ultimately what insight it can provide about a reader. The highlighted skills represented here show each of the foundational skill subtests that are within Read Basics. And you'll notice they span the whole spectrum of foundational skills. So Margaret was talking about those word level skills with word recognition, decoding, and vocabulary, to the phrase level. And morphology is a unique one because it kind of spans across the word level and sentence level too. And then the sentence level skills, which include obviously sentence processing, and then reading fluency, to the whole text level skill of basic reading comprehension. Let's see, can you go back one slide? There we go. So the sentence processing test takes between 5 and 9 minutes, and it includes 30 items and is offered at 3 different difficulty levels. And you can see that it's possible here to gather a ton of information about a reader's foundational skills in a short amount of time. So like the word recognition, decoding, morphology, fluency, all of those tests are 30 items, and they take less than 10 minutes each. And then as far as sentence processing, skilled sentence processing is the ability to comprehend sentences of varying complexity using cues such as temporal, referential, relational, and causal connectors and conjunctions. The ability to understand the nuanced meanings of sentences is important for grasping the overall meaning of text, especially as they get into higher grades. Lower sentence processing skills can be due to weaknesses in the preceding skills that we saw, and or a lack of familiarity with cues. So the sentence processing subtest uses 2 types of items to measure sentence processing knowledge, discourse markers and internal logic. So here's an example of one of the items. Ray leaned his bike blank the wall. And so obviously the reader has to apply the correct word into that sentence to give it the appropriate meaning. And then we have a couple other sample items. So again, they have to use the discourse marker or internal logic to determine which item or which option fits best. So this can get pretty difficult because Margaret showed us the vast spectrum of discourse markers and how complexity can get ramped up very quickly in content area texts. So because there's that complexity and that spectrum of discourse markers, Read Basics is offered at 3 different difficulty levels. And you can see the range of reference and conjunctions that are encountered depending on the difficulty level. So for instance, historians or scientists may have a different set of common discourse markers. So it's important to expose students to that variety that exists in sentence and text structures. And then as far as information we get from this assessment, I'm going to just start with the group report. So at the group view, it gives us a glimpse of the complexity of strengths and needs represented by, say, a class of 20-some students. It's interesting to see in this example how skills across the word level and phrase level and sentence level vary. So like the word level abilities and decoding and vocabulary, those bars are kind of similar. I should mention that the 4 colors represented there are how students are organized into performance level. So the red is weak, orange is low average, green is high average, and blue is strong. But it's just interesting to see how the word level skills kind of correlate, and that's not always the case. But then in this class, the sentence level, sentence processing and reading fluency also are quite similar. And then in the class view, we can dig a little bit deeper. And Read Basics allows us to sort by skill or lexile. So you can see the column headings at the top. I've sorted this data set by the sentence processing skill. You'll notice the columns are arranged in this manner on purpose. So they move from the word level skills on the left all the way to the full text level on the right. So let's look at a couple of these students. The first one there, you can stay on that page just for a sec. The first one there, it has really strong word level skills, but is lacking the sentence level skills. And then Brooks Larson, a little bit further down, it kind of has the opposite thing going on, where that student might be compensating for a lack of word level skills with context clues and things like that. And then as far as what we can get out of this, obviously Read Basics is designed to provide insightful data that ultimately informs instruction. So if we dug into a specific student or given some resources, actually I think one of them on here is one of the ones that was mentioned in the chat. And but it really is, the resources depend on the student's level in that skill, and then we provide resources that make sense for them. And they even include some tier 1 instructional resources that can be used in content area classrooms too. Hopefully we can provide targeted instruction to meet the learner's need and see students develop, moving into stronger performance levels in each foundational skill. And at the bottom is just an example of kind of a growth chart that we can see how the skills in that class in sentence processing moved from the beginning of the year, where they were all in the weak or low average performance level. By the end of the year, we even have a good percentage of students in the strong performance level. I did want to touch on, Amy had mentioned a question about lexiles. And Margaret, can you go back to the class view? I thought that might be a good resource. So in Read Basics, the lexile, she just asked if we could discuss lexile levels and how we should use that data. And I hope I'm doing your question justice, Amy. But I just wanted to talk about that just for a moment. So Lexile here is computed from the last three subtests: sentence processing, reading efficiency, and reading comprehension. So Lexile, I view Lexile more as a resource for teachers and families and less as like a diagnostic or something that's going to inform instruction. And I hope if that didn't do it justice, feel free to ask it another way, or I'll pass it back off to Margaret.
All right. Well, thanks, Ryan. So as far as when we're just about near the end here, but I just want to address that it is really important for us to be able to assess sentence processing skills because we want to be able to see if students can grasp meaning at that sentence level. So we know that poor sentence processing skills may indicate that there is some trouble for the student in terms of not being able to comprehend. So we've gone over several strategies that you could use in order to really support students in developing their sentence processing skills. As far as as far as the webinar goes, we will stay on. If you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. But thank you so much for attending. We do definitely hope that you got something out of it that you can take back to your own classroom or school. Dina, that's a great question. So Dina's asked, does learning this then have students thinking about syntax so much that they lose the bigger picture of what they're reading? And you're thinking about younger students. So as far as that goes, kind of with everything that we're kind of like teaching, I would say that the dosage of this should be like 15 minutes a few times a week. So we can use it to really support students in developing their reading comprehension, but not like overly focusing on it. So these are often done within classrooms that I've worked at in as sort of like a mini lesson and then part of the ELA block where students are playing with language. And I say playing because I do think that that's just really important in order to play. And I think with younger students too, you can definitely support them in developing their sentence processing skills by playing with like the syntax surgery, things like that. But making it fun and pretty short, 15 minutes or so. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, that's another great question, Dina. So she's asking what reading behaviors might indicate that sentence processing is the issue versus something else. What we like to do is ensure that it isn't something else. So we'll definitely do that word level analysis first to determine is the student struggling with decoding. And if they are, that's often the starting point because if we can't decode, it's really hard to make meaning across text. So what we would likely see, and when Ryan was sharing the slide of that class view of students, if a student's really struggling with sentence processing and also reading comprehension, we definitely want to do something to support that sentence level. Are they able to make meaning across the text? So that might actually mean like when they're reading, they're not reading at that phrasal level. So that could be an indication of that sentence processing issue. If students can read at that phrasal level, we don't see a lot of issues within sentence processing. But what I would say is kind of just to go back to what I had just said is it would be important to ensure that you are getting a diagnostic that tells you if the student is struggling with decoding or is it more of this sentence level skill. All right, well, thank you so much for attending.